There's 3 reasons that you're overstaffed. One is that you have too much ministry that you're trying to do, right? When they're paying above that 55% for staffing, or if they're staffed one full-time person for every 30, 35 people, you're either trying to do too much ministry. So really, we're never going to have enough people. We're just way too broad in our approach on our ministry strategies. The second is...
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. So glad you joined us today. Hey, is your church overstaffed? Answer is maybe. Probably. We're going to talk about that and a lot of other church metric stuff with Amy Anderson. She is the principal of the Unstuck group. And you may know the Unstuck group. Tony Morgan, its founder and CEO, passed away very unexpectedly last year. We talk about the dynamics. What happens when your leader dies? What do you do? How does the organization continue? What about grief? All of that and a whole lot more. So really glad you joined us today. Make sure you like, subscribe, leave a comment to join the conversation. And we will get to my conversation with Amy Anderson right after a word from today's partners. Then we'll dive into the conversation. This episode is brought to you by Gloo Messaging. So I got to ask you, are your church messages hitting home or are you getting lost in the noise? Like, if you're ready to make your communication more personal and more effective, why don't you check out the new free Gloo texting platform? With Gloo Messaging, it's easy to segment your audience into groups. Think like small group leaders, volunteers, parents, new visitors, so that you send the right message to the right person at exactly the right time. And here's the point. It is not one size fits all, okay? It's personal. It's powerful communication that actually gets read. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to save time. Your people will feel more seen, more valued, and more connected. And it's free. Gloo gives you 10,000 texts every month and 3 groups at absolutely no cost. So start using group texting to lead better today. Sign up now at gloo.com/messaging. That's gloo.com/messaging. Hey, this episode is brought to you by the Art of Leadership Academy. So if this podcast is part of your growth and rhythm in leadership, I think you're going to love what I'm going to share with you. Inside my Art of Leadership Academy, we have just opened up a few brand new spaces for you to lead more effectively and grow your leadership. And the price, you're going to love it. It's absolutely free. So what I would love for you to do is go and set up your free account today, because you're going to be able to join a life-giving online community. Think social media, but only for pastors and church leaders who are looking to grow and support each other. You can cut the noise, the trolls, the junk you get everywhere else. Actually, it's just a community of church leaders who really care about the mission of the church. I would love for you to be involved. And the big part of this is you'll be able to connect with other podcast listeners about each episode of my podcast, including me. I'm going to be active on there. You'll get exclusive insights by asking questions, sharing insights, and learning how others are applying what they're learning on this podcast to real life situations in their church and ministry or their business. So everything you get will help you lead more effectively, to grow faster and thrive in life and leadership. I'd love for you to get started today. And here's how you do it. Create a free account. It's pretty simple. Click the link in the description of this episode or visit theartofleadershipacademy.com. Couple clicks, you're in. It's free. Look forward to seeing you inside. Amy, I'm really glad to have you on the podcast. Thanks for saying yes.
Yeah, great to be here with you, Carrie.
And I just want to say, I mean, the sorrow of losing Tony Morgan was such a shared sorrow. I mean, for Emily, for his family, his kids, for your team. But I love Tony and loved him on a personal level, but also really loved what he was able to bring to the church. And I know I speak on behalf of a lot of people who listen to this podcast, just to extend, my sympathies for losing Tony. Can you walk us through, because there's always, I think I know what happened with Tony. It was a very sudden passing. And the thing that really surprised me is I've had a lot of meals with Tony. The dude eats the salad, not the fries. You know what I mean? He's fit. He takes good care of himself. And for his life to be cut short so quickly was, I think, a shock, as well as a lot of sadness. Can you tell us, for those who may not know, kind of what happened with Tony and the Unstuck group and his really sad passing?
Yeah. Well, it was shocking. Absolutely. For me, and I'm sure for many others, it's one of those moments where you always remember where you were, what you were doing when you heard the news. And it was on Monday, September 2nd, this past fall, that he had a heart attack. And you're right, it was completely out of the blue. There was no forewarning. There were no signs of illness, nothing. In fact, those first hours and days, we were hopeful for a recovery, thinking we might have to bump some of his clients back. And, part of it, and you get this, Carrie, because you're a remote team, but it was really a rough couple of days being a remote team because we weren't able to be present with Emily or with his family. And we weren't able to be present with even one another, right? And then the shock of Wednesday when he died. I mean, he was here and then he was just gone. And it was really, really hard to come to terms with that. He was so much more than our boss. Like you said, he was our friend, just a faith-filled, mission-driven man to the end.
And his insights. I mean, I used to, still do, hang on to the, for the Q1, Q2, Q3 Unstuck reports. I always thought that was fascinating. And he just had insight like nobody else. And, cause of death, I believe, was a heart attack, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
He had a heart
Raking
attack.
his leaves in his yard?
Yeah, he and Emily were just out doing light yard work, honestly. And he just wasn't feeling good. And he said, Em, I'm going to go in and just lay down for a little bit. And thankfully, she went in with him. So there's, a sense that he was with her when he never came back after he had that heart attack. His body was alive for a couple of days, but she was able to be there with him. But it was nothing strenuous. That's why it makes it all so shocking.
I've been to that house. I've been to their house, and I just feel for all of them. Taking over for a founder is no small thing. And, the business Tony was sort of the face of the business, but he had a whole team and a group of consultants and everything. What was going through your mind in the first few weeks after Tony's passing? I mean, you think about the impact of a team, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who can identify with, and maybe even if they can't identify, can imagine what would happen if the senior pastor, if the CEO, if the leader, and particularly a founder. There's something about a founder that is very different than just, we're the 40th pastor in 200 years, or the 8th CEO. There's something about a founder that is really unique. So what was going through your mind in the days and weeks after Tony's passing?
Man, from a personal standpoint, nothing was going through my head those first few weeks. We were all literally in shock, and it seemed absolutely impossible to believe. And again, being a remote team, we didn't have any of those cues that helped us accept the loss. There was no empty office for us to see. There were no gatherings to process what happened. It was just disbelief. I kept expecting him just to show back up in our Zoom rooms, right? So once the funeral had been set, we all just focused on gathering with our Unstuck team and to say goodbye to the man who had pulled this ragtag group of leaders together. We call ourselves the Unstuckers, a group that really shared his passion for the local church. And after that, as we began to take our first steps forward, which, by the way, was really hard, Carrie, in some ways, getting back to our ministry and back to the routine, it just felt wrong. Like it didn't feel right doing this without Tony, almost like it was dishonoring him to be carrying this forward without him. And I guess that's the way we feel in loss, right? Like the whole world just needs to stop for a while.
What do you think was underneath that? Why did it feel wrong?
Oh, me personally, I felt like I don't deserve this. I didn't build this. I didn't create this. Tony did all this, and I got to be a part of it. And so to think about doing it without him being there was really a really hard thing to wrestle with. But our team, we knew from Tony that his desire was to see this ministry continue long after he was in leadership. It was always his desire to see the leadership torch pass to the next generation of leaders. And he and I, being the same age, we had many conversations about succession for each of us. We were making plans. I just thought we'd exit together. But apparently I'm the bridge now. And, a side note, I think Tony has always been, I know he has always been such an advocate of women in leadership.
Yeah.
And I think it would make him smile that this will be a part of our history now, Unstuck history. But back to your original question, what was going through my mind when I realized the Unstuck group's future was now in my hands? I honestly never did. We have always been such a team-based organization. In fact, our team was up with you back in 2019.
Yeah, we were talking about that. That was such a good trip. You came to my house, backyard, hung out for a couple of days. I don't know that I helped you, but you guys really helped me.
I still have my notes from that day. You've got a chip in your brain I don't have about kind of future. And actually, just like Tony, it seems like you both can take a lot of information and just bring it down to a really concise statement I have to process out loud to ever get my thoughts to come together.
No, it's an incredible team. When you and Tony were talking about succession, what was the conversation like? And good for Tony. And again, just to set the context, that probably started when he turned 50 or before that, a few years before he passed?
Yeah, we would probably have been talking about it for about 3 years at that point.
Yeah, so
I had
50s.
shared with him when I was going to retire. He was actually kind of on that same time frame. And it was interesting. It was always a tangled conversation because if we had an opening on our team, the ability to add someone, we are always trying to look for a unicorn. Like we want someone who can do content, who also has this and this and this and this. And finally, it was Tiffany who threw the red flag in, and she's like, "Stop it! Let's just figure out what our business needs right now and not entangle this in succession because it always went that way. Like, and maybe this hire could become X, but the truth is." You weren't going to hire another Tony and another Amy. You're going to have a whole different mix of giftings that we're going to need to come to the table. So, yeah. So our leadership team, there were 4 of us and now it was down to 3. But I said to the team, now we're a 3-legged stool and that still offers support and stability. So we just leaned in together and started asking again in these early days, what would Tony do? And we each used our giftings to carry Unstuck forward. My lane is a little more public, and Tony and I definitely carried a lot of the consulting. So that's where I put my focus, creating content for pastors, serving churches, and being the leader of Unstuck. And I just have to say, Tony, he set me up well to step into that role. And God really gave me a peace and a confidence just to lean in this season.
One of the things I'm very cognizant of, because I didn't do this well in the early days of leadership, but a mentor of mine, Terry Wardle, talks about grieving your losses.
Yeah.
And how important that is. How did your team grieve Tony's passing?
Oh, in some ways we still are.
Yeah. It hasn't even been a year.
No, 7 months, something like that. When we went down for the funeral, I actually rented a big Airbnb. And so all of the Unstuckers from across the country, we were able to stay all together for those couple of days that we were in Atlanta. We brought in Antico Pizza, which was one of Tony's favorites. We did things like that, and we just hung out and we found a space and lots of rooms where we could just remember Tony and grieve together. Again, that the remoteness of it was a delayed grief. And I think it takes longer to walk through some of the, milestones of grief when you can't be present. So for us, all of us getting together was a really important part of those 2 days when we were in Atlanta. And then we're trying to see if we can get everyone together at the end of this year again. We're still processing, but I'll tell you what, Tony poured into us so much, and we are all enjoying pouring back to his legacy and into the Unstuck group. And God has just shown up in amazing ways.
For those people who are founders or senior leaders, what did Tony do well to set you up for this unexpected transition? I mean, yeah, it's coming down the road, right? But the timing was totally premature and out of the blue.
Yeah. Well, me and Tiffany were talking. He was just ridiculously focused on keeping the main thing. So there's ideas, there's a lot of things that, people ask us if we'll do this, we'll do that. And he just kept the lane of what Unstuck is about really clear. And as he built out our team, he was so good at putting together different skill sets, different giftings to really make a solid team where we weren't all alike. We were very complementary. And so that laser focus, I think, is something that helped us because we're good planners. We work our plans, we reevaluate. We have, our culture shaping behaviors that we talk about. It's things like constant improvement. It's things like, mission driven, interdependent skills, on the team, that we're all confident in what God's given us, but we completely lean on one another's gifting. So that's just the culture he set that we were able to lead out of when we didn't have him.
Leadership styles are always different. You and Tony
Mm-hmm.
worked together. You hosted a lot of things, including a podcast together.
Yeah.
But your style is going to be different than his. What are the biggest differences between you and Tony? And then how has that impacted the team?
Yeah. Well, Tony and I do have a lot in common when it comes to leadership style, although we are hardwired very differently. And I would say, again, very complementary, actually. So Tony, if we look at the disc, Tony's high D. He's more analytical. Me, I'm a high I. I'm much more relational. My team will say that I'm the one that brings the fun. It's really funny. You mentioned the podcast. When Tony and I first started recording it, we would give each other feedback. And I said to him early on, I said, can you just bring a little more energy? And he's like, this is it. This is all I've got.
Yeah. Tony, he wasn't a monotone, but like he was like always just steady as she goes.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Working genius, Tony's invention, discernment. Man, I know you saw this. He has such a gift of discernment. But me, I'm more galvanizing, enablement. I love to move, work forward, build systems and processes. In fact, I think Tony knew we needed systems when he hired me. Prior to when he offered me the job on the team, I was actually a contractor with Unstuck. So I had a full-time job, but I served churches throughout the year. And I noticed when I came on board, we just had very little documentation of our systems. So when it was just Tony, of course, he didn't need them. It was all in his head. It was just pure talent. But for someone like me, I want clarity on what we're doing. And he had invited me to an annual planning meeting, again, before I was on staff. And I just said, I think we need to define the Unstuck way so that whoever we send to a church, we have confidence that our brand will be well represented. And the next week, he offered me a full-time job. So it came together.
Fantastic. What do you do? You mentioned, you asked the question, what would Tony do? Which I think is very fair. And we're not even a year into it. But how much is that something you want to continue doing? Because Tony was very good at adopting, right? Like 2025 is not the same as 2024. And
that's right.
Look at what's happening in the economy right now. It's a yo-yo.
Yeah.
Where have you broken with tradition so far? Do you feel a permission to say, yeah, Tony probably wouldn't have done it this way, but we got to preserve the mission, change the method? I'm just wondering how you're looking at that months down the road.
Yeah. The good news is that I worked with Tony for 10 years. And my style is I tend to study my leader and then I have to figure out, do I agree with it? And I was just so in step with Tony on his philosophies. So there's going to be a lot of easy parallel with kind of how I make decisions. I'm sure the day will come when I would maybe want to do something different than what I think Tony would have done. But I think when that arises, I'll pause because, I will think on that. It won't be a fast move. And I'll lean in on Tiffany and Sean, who have some of those discernment gifts before we do it. But if I feel it's the right thing, I'll make the call and we'll either find out it was the right call or we'll fail forward. So,
what did you do to stabilize the team, Amy?
Well, I mean, when Tony died, when
Tony died, it's a, I know I was swapping texts with friends who are like, did Tony have a succession plan? Is anyone we didn't know, right? And you may have had a much greater sense of what to do, but I'm just wondering, everybody's reeling personally and they're wondering, do I have a job in 2 months, et cetera? So what did you do to stabilize the team? Because I found even going through COVID 5 years ago, one of the first things I did was tell everybody, hey, we have margin in the company, you've got a job. We got, multi-month, I think it was a 6-month runway before we really have to look at cuts.
Yep.
We're just cash surplus people. I know Tony is wired in a
Tony is
similar
too.
way,
Mhm.
very similar way. And I'm like, hey, everybody, it's going to be okay. Let's just figure out what to do. And of course, it went on to be our best year to date at that point.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious, like, what do you do to stabilize the team and let everybody know that, hey, we have a future here?
Yeah. You would have thought that's where our brains would have gone. Like, what's going to, I mean, we did have some of that, right?
Mhm.
What's going to happen with Unstuck? Will this survive the loss of the main face of our organization? So definitely some of that going on, but you're absolutely right. Again, credit to Tony. He built up cash reserves. And so we knew there was nothing urgent that we had to worry about from a financial perspective. And that helped us really put our focus, especially, in the months that followed, on good communication with our clients, internally, checking in on one another, and just diving into some of the areas of the ministry that none of us had experience in, especially like the operational side, right? Taxes, finances, legal. Taxes were due right around the time that Tony passed away.
Yeah.
And his wife Emily would be like, I have no idea. And so we were distracted with things like that we just had to figure out. So I don't think we worried so much as we wondered, and then just got busy with the things that we had to do to keep everything running and rolling. But yeah.
Emily's not on this podcast, so I want to be careful in how I ask the question. But, I think about this too, because, Tony and I, my wife, started the company. It's a personal company, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And we just recently merged with Gloo. But when you have that kind of partnership, it feels like a family business, even though there are a lot of other people. How have you, and I'm asking the question because a lot of churches operate that way. As you know, you're a church consultant.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
I mean, not so much in mainline denominations, but if you're a founder or you're part more of the charismatic world, it kind of feels or functions more like a family affair than otherwise. So how have you navigated those dynamics with Emily?
Yeah, this is, again, it just sucks being remote. Can I say that? Because we would love to spend so much more FaceTime with Emily and share meals and walk with her. So I actually end up going to Atlanta quite a bit. So in fact, I just had Emily join me at a church in Athens, Georgia, so that she could see the process. She wasn't on the business side of things, but she was definitely Tony's partner in Unstuck becoming a reality and how she supported him. So brought her out just to see the process in action. I try to share a meal with her whenever I'm going through Atlanta. She'll join us on our calls, our Zoom calls, just to be around the business. She trusts us to run it, but she'll text the churches we're serving. She'll send the thank you notes. So she's still staying engaged. And I think that helps her navigate, especially this first year of just, this was so much who Tony was, helps her stay close. And she's very mission minded too, with when the Unstuck group, came into being. It was her who said, maybe you should do this, instead of being on staff at a church. So we try to stay in contact the best we can and see her whenever we can. She's coming out here to Minnesota in July for our team meeting. And then we're going to have the next one at her house in the fall. So those touches help.
What's been the most difficult moment for you as the leader, the CEO now?
Let me think about that.
Sure. No rush.
Mm-hmm. I think the most difficult part for me, it's going to sound so cliche, is not doing this with Tony. There's a missing foundation that we have now. And at the same time, it was a really helpful conversation for me. I mentioned earlier, that, well, I don't remember how I said it, but a little bit of that guilt, as we moved forward without him. I was actually kind of frustrated that we started to thrive again. And I know that sounds weird, but again, part of me felt like this should come to a screeching halt without my friend. there's part of me that felt that way in the background. And, trying to balance those thoughts out, I remember we were on a call with our advisory team. And it's the first time we gathered since we had lost Tony. So, shared the story and we're talking about things. But one of them said that as long as we have churches, we need the Unstuck group. And I thought, yep, that's true. And it also aligned with the fact that Tony wanted this thing to go to the next generation. And that was a little pivot in my brain that helped me just start to lead forward with confidence and to feel good about the fact that we were doing well, feel good about the fact churches were signing up, that the podcast had rebounded, because none of us knew, again, what it would be like without Tony's main face there. So that was a helpful conversation and confirming as we moved forward out of 2024 into 2025.
I think it probably is a bit of a surprise. Tony did build out a team. He didn't brand it. Wasn't the Tony Morgan company. But right. I think it is a little bit of a surprise that within months, the company is thriving. What were the factors? Do you have a theory on why the company started to thrive, why churches kept reaching out, going, can you come in and do a consultation with us? Any thoughts on that, Amy?
Yeah. Part of it is just, again, the leader himself, Tony. Wasn't it John Maxwell who wrote about the level 5 leader, that when they step down from ministry, the ministry moves on seamlessly? And if I'm quoting it right, a level 5 leader is described as someone people follow because of who they are and who they represent. So I think our team followed Tony's leadership because of who he was and what he represented. And we were set up long before he stepped down, before we lost him, to, be decision makers, to think strategically, to be an interdependent team. And again, his superpower was keeping us focused. So we just got back. We planned well, and we started running the plays. We were working our plan. And I think we just had God's hand of protection on this ministry. So that flywheel started going by running the plays we had already designed, by following how Tony led. And of course, we asked the questions once in a while, like, what would Tony do, right? That's still a regular question for us. But that helped us move forward. And lastly, I would also say the unique factor that enabled us to move forward was really the people that make up our team. This is not a job for any of us. I know you get this. In fact, I think we all took pay cuts to actually join the team. But it wasn't about the corporate ladder. It wasn't about worldly achievement. It was just this shared passion for the local church. And I think that's why that comment hit me. As long as there's churches, we need the Unstuck group. Because my life's trajectory was completely changed because of the local church. Well, Jesus, of course, but the local church,
through the
they
local
were ready
church.
for me. They were ready for me and for my husband and our 3 little kids in tow. And that experience changed our lives. Tiffany on our team, she's a pastor's kid. So for us, it was our mission that drove us to continue our mission.
Yeah. I want to dive into the data because I love the Unstuck report that comes out. I read it voraciously. Just some meta trends that I want to drill into, which I think a lot of people will hold up the mirror and go, uh-oh, or good for us. But one of the trends that shows up is growing churches have 30% fewer paid staff and 20% more volunteers. Percentages will vary from season to season. But interesting, if you're a growing church, you have fewer staff, not more, and you have more volunteers. What is behind that trend, Amy?
Yeah, and actually it's 30% fewer paid staff and 20% more volunteer leaders. Leaders is the key word there.
Not just volunteers, volunteer leaders.
That's right. So these healthy growing churches have done some specific things. Not rocket science, but number one, they're hiring, multiplying, equipping leaders into staff roles. Right. And so these people who are hired on staff, they know that regardless of their title, whether they're the family pastor, the discipleship pastor, they are primarily team builders. They are not doing the ministry. They've embraced this Ephesians 4, let's give ministry away to the body. And that's their perspective. Sometimes in declining churches, you'll have staff who feel like serving's a burden, right? They don't have the time. They say no for people. These churches, no, they've embraced, like 1 Corinthians 12, we got to build out the body of Christ. So they're pursuing volunteer leaders, not just volunteers, but they're inviting leaders they share a problem. Will you come help me solve this? They sit across the table from them and invite them to own something within the church. Tony often said, high-level volunteer leaders don't want a job description. They want a cause. They want a problem, something they can dive into. And these churches actually build out their org charts to include volunteer leaders in them. So it's an intentional build out. And then, of course, this was actually a quote I heard at Tony's funeral. I was talking to my good friend, Kim Meyer, and she said, when Tony hired me at Granger, he congratulated me on being hired and said, you're here because of all your gifts and talents, what you've accomplished. But just know, going forward, I will never praise you for what you do. I will only praise you for what you give away. So that's the mentality in these churches that are staffing lower and engaging high volunteer leaders.
How do you think churches, because I run into this question regularly, it's always, we need more staff, we need more staff. And
Yes.
sometimes you look at the percentage of their budget that they're spending on staff and it's like, actually, you're probably overstaffed.
Yeah.
How do you think churches fall into that trap?
Well, I'll tell you what, the churches that often feel like they're the most understaffed are usually the most overstaffed.
It's true.
Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right. It's like, the people who want to pay you the least are the most trouble. It's weird.
Yeah. And I think they've just developed a culture where every time they have a need, they think they need to hire a staff person to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a low level of leadership, unfortunately. So we're hiring people onto our teams who are really wired for that tenacity area, get stuff done. I have to do it myself. That's why they're paying me. And they haven't been envisioned and challenged and actually given permission to let things go and to build it out the way that they should. Other times, I often say it this way, there's 3 reasons that you're overstaffed. One is that you have too much ministry that you're trying to do, right? When they're paying above that 55% for staffing, or if they're staffed one full-time person for every 30, 35 people, you're either trying to do too much ministry. So really, we're never going to have enough people. We're just way too broad in our approach on our ministry strategies. The second is they don't have enough volunteers engaged in their ministry. And the third is that they're doing both of those. I'm actually working with a church right now, and their staff was just in the health assessment. We're understaffed. And I'm sitting there, with the vital signs in my back pocket going, you are so overstaffed, but we'll discover that.
What are some of the vital signs? I want to get into that a little bit more because it is a very common problem. For someone listening, they're like, yeah, no, I'm definitely understaffed. How would they know that that's accurate?
Yeah, there's 2 metrics I look at. One would be, what percentage of your budget are you spending on staffing? And that's, by the way, all staff. It's ministers, it's operations.
Janitorial.
Yes, it's benefits. It's all
Does
that
it include
stuff.
contracts, like independent contractors?
Yeah, we would put that in that bucket too.
Okay, so basically anybody that you're paying to do the work of ministry.
Yeah, we're running to get ready for our next Unstuck Church report. We're actually delving into a few more questions about what we're paying in contracting dollars and what positions. So I'm excited to be able to share that information. There's just very little information out there.
So it's all inclusive, part-time, full-time, facility, contractors, and what are the healthy percentages of total budget?
So we would say healthy growing churches are in that 45 to 55%. That's what they're spending on their staffing.
Yeah.
The other helpful metric, and this is where I'll talk about full-time equivalents. So full-time equivalent would be, taking all your full-time people and say you've got 30, and then you take all of your part-time hours, add those together, divide by 40 to get a full-time equivalent to that. We would say you want to take your average weekend attendance and divide it by your FTEs. And what is healthy is that you hire 1 full-time equivalent for every 75 people that attend your church. And by the way, it used to be 100 to 1, but we've kind of incorporated in the whole trend that people are going to church less. So we backed off it a bit. But right now, I think in our last report, it's something like we're hovering around 62, somewhere between 55 and 62. So we haven't gotten back yet to that healthy level overall with churches.
So still overstaffed. So according to your metrics then, once your church reaches let's say 150, you should be looking for a second full-time staff person?
Yes.
I get this question a lot, so let me pick your brain. Who would you hire? You're, let's say, a church plant, or let's say you're a legacy church. I'm thinking about the churches that I started at a while back now, and I was solo until we hit about 3 years in, about 150, and I hired an assistant. Just to help. Do you have a recommendation? Pardon me, a recommendation as to the best person to hire as a second person?
Yeah. So once the lead pastor can bring some people on, obviously you need, at least in today's context, you need worship and production. So that
was another hire too around the same time. But
you can contract that out for a season. But that's probably the next critical position. And then children's pastor would be our recommendation.
Which
get
pastor?
Someone over that children's.
Children's
get to that family
before
ministry
students?
side. Yeah.
Okay.
Children's before
Explain
student.
that. Why kids before students?
It's just as we've gone through and looked at the data on things, churches that have a healthy, thriving kids ministry, then you will actually have a student ministry going forward. But if you put the emphasis on students and not the kids, you're going to lose that opportunity to connect and attract and to engage families, young families.
A real emphasis in the church in the last few years has been discipleship. I'm getting more questions all the time about, do we need to hire a discipleship pastor? Would that be one of your first hires? And if not, why not?
Probably not the first ones. If we just do the math, now we've got the lead pastor, we've got worship covered, we've got kids ministry covered. There might be some operational role that needs to come on board at some point. We talk about facilities, admin support, something in there. I would probably think something like that would show up first, unless you've got a high-level volunteer who can run finances. I guess, we do have committees and things. So if that stuff is covered, I would go towards discipleship. I'm backpedaling a little bit, but that leader who can oversee all of those next steps that you want people to take beyond the weekend service.
Another interesting trend that has been in your studies and other studies for years, and Tony was the first one to point this out to me.
Of course.
Declining churches actually have higher per capita giving.
Yes, they do.
And that's like totally counterintuitive. So you got money in the bank, you're exceeding budget, and you're actually declining, but growing churches are often strapped for cash. True?
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Well, here's what no one metric will give you a good picture of your health, right? Or the story of your church. But let's just talk about this financial one, when it's strong. Let's just say, for example, if your per capita giving is increasing, it's high, and so is your attendance, number of people being baptized, number of people serving, then celebrate the increased giving because it looks like it's just a reflection of people following Jesus and becoming more generous. But let's say your growth is actually down 5%, and the percentage of people serving is like 80%, groups 80%, and giving is up. Well, warning. Those are telltale signs the church is becoming insider focused because they're moving from the momentum side of the church life cycle to the declining side. Does that make sense?
It does, because I study this stuff, but can you explain it a little bit more? It would be like, wait, what is that a sign of? Like not enough new people or what?
Yeah, well, attendance is down, but more telling is that they have so many people in serving in groups and giving that there's nobody new offsetting any of those numbers. So it looks good on a report card to have 80%, but there's a story behind that number, right? And by the way, overall, if giving looks strong, but your reach metrics are lagging, that's also a warning sign because if you don't interrupt that, the church will be moving towards maintenance and becoming an insider church focus club. And by reach metrics, I mean in-person attendance. That's going to give you an indication if new people are connecting to your church. Online attendance, new people in your database, baptisms or decisions to follow Jesus. Those are all lead indicators that point to a growing church versus a declining church.
Okay, super helpful. What are 2 or 3 other surprising data points, like that most leaders would find surprising in your reports, in the studies that you do of churches?
Sure. Like the differences between growing and declining churches?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So none of it surprises me. I've been looking at these differences between growing and declining churches for 10 years now, and the data consistently repeats itself. Like growing churches are 50% more likely to offer one style of worship. Okay. The key word there is only. Declining churches are much more likely to have multiple styles of worship for people.
Okay. Can we break that one down? I want to hear them, but I want to do them one by one.
Sure.
That totally resonates with me. So in other words, is that like they either started with one style of worship or somebody bit the bullet and said, enough with this blended, traditional, contemporary stuff. I'm going to, go through a season of discontent. Like why is that such a consistent data point? Like what is underneath that?
I think when churches nail down one worship style, they have clarity on who they're trying to reach. And they're saying, what is the best hour we can put together that's going to reach them? I think when the churches that have multiple worship venues or styles, they're trying to keep people happy. So, and then that blended example, I love it. I'm like, a blended service, nobody likes it. Nobody wins in that one, right? It doesn't reach anyone. But when we try to keep these other services alive, we aren't thinking strategically. Now, I should back off. There are some churches that I coach and say, yes, keep your traditional service because of the legacy, because of, factors. It's a large group of people. But we really talk about, we have to design what the main offering's going to be. And we need to more internally, like, let's not promote that service. Let's not confuse people who want to come to our church by telling them, come at this time for this time for that time for this. We want to be really clear front facing on what is the main invitable service we're trying to bring people to. But there are times you have to honor that group.
Yeah. Why would you give some churches a pass on that? Why would you say it's okay for you, but not for most people? Because I bet you most listeners are like, oh, that's me. I must get a pass.
Yeah. I would say try not to take the pass. But there's a large church I'm working with in Oklahoma right now, and they're just learning how to turn the ship's rudder. They're just starting to turn their church. And I think if they kicked it in, we're a lake family out here, right? In Minnesota, we're on lakes over the summer. You kind of know, like if you're in a speedboat and you go from 1 to 5, you're going to shoot a lot of people off the back of the boat. That's what they're doing. They're trying to get up to speed, but they're going to have to make some wise strategic timing decisions about how they get to their destination. So churches, they need to find a destination and then create a plan to get there. Because here's the deal. Whatever you decide, you're going to lose people. It's just choosing who you're going to lose.
Is there a timeline that you recommend? When I was on that journey, that was a number of years ago now, I picked 5 years. It's like, okay, we're here, but in 5 years, this is what we're going to be. And we blended, and it was sort of blending in a little bit of the new stuff. And then at the end, it was blending out the last of the old until we made the transition.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that whatever aligns with your vision, because vision has to precede these changes. The why has to become known. People need to get excited about the why. And so, if there's a 3-year vision, it should be included in that. So everyone knows what we're working towards, what the milestones will be. And again, sometimes 3 years to 5 years, a lot of those issues take care of themselves, right? We're moving towards it. So, and when the churches start to see how making some of these strategic changes are beginning to fill their seats with their kids and their grandkids, it's very motivating to get behind and support the change.
What are some other surprising differences between growing and declining churches?
Again, probably not surprising, but continuing again year over year, declining churches have larger church boards and 4 times as many committees. And so these churches, the growing churches, right, they have more volunteer leaders. They put leaders into ministry, not into meetings. And they get clarity around, this is how we make decisions. This is where we have input. But declining churches with these large boards and these large groups of committees, they might have high volunteer percentages, but they're all caught up in meetings and they aren't really doing ministry.
They're making decisions, not disciples. Yeah. Anything else that is surprising between large and small or declining and growing churches?
Nothing that I can say is surprising.
Okay.
I mean, I could throw out the one too that growing churches use small group strategies, declining churches use Sunday school strategies. And we've been saying that for years, but the data keeps coming in to parallel that.
Gen Z, you argue, are dramatically underrepresented on church staff teams. Can you give us an idea on how underrepresented, and then what are some solutions to that?
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak to how underrepresented, but I can talk about solutions, and just want to credit Dan Zimbardi. He's the executive pastor at Sandals Church out in California. We interviewed him on our podcast a while ago, and what they've really embraced is this come follow me approach to this generation. He said, part of my strategies for equipping is to bring young leaders to as many significant meetings and presentations as possible to accelerate their development. So if we want to empower next generation leaders, we have to equip them, but we also have to invite them along on that journey. He cited, what Jesus modeled, come follow me, I will send you out to fish for people. So we need to be intentional about looking for those come follow me moments to raise up the next generation. We need to give them a seat at the table, right? They don't want a job. They want to, just like all of us, we want to contribute. We want to be heard. So you don't have to put them on your senior leadership team, but you should get them a voice and a seat at the table now and again. As you preach, right? They should be in those message meetings. They should be giving feedback and part of it. So it's just about engaging them, not pigeonholing them, and not giving them just a job, but getting their voice in the mix and valuing their perspective.
So I sometimes get questions from leaders who are like, is the future, does it really belong to larger churches and multi-site churches? And a lot of the data that I'm seeing suggests that perhaps it does, that the vast majority, I think Warren Bird says the vast majority of people attend a larger church with more than one location. Like, yes, there are more churches that don't have multiple locations and are smaller. But when you look at millions of people attending church, the larger multi-site churches are overrepresented in that number. What is your data showing?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing more and more churches are going multi-site, the ones that are growing, and it makes sense, right? Because multi-site's not new anymore. We have 25 years of data.
Easy.
We know how it works, and it helps you have the benefits of being a big church, but it also helps you be a small church, right? We're both big and small when we're in multi-site. And so for churches that are growing, you're eventually going to have this problem of how are we going to expand?
Out of space.
Now that out of space and this flywheel's going, I was just working with the church again in the Atlanta area, and he hired me for one thing to help on staffing and structure. But I'm like, dude, what are you going to do? You're out of space. And we probably need to get a multiplication plan and process for you. So when you've got this flywheel, you've got to get ahead of it and figure out what's our plan to multiply. And of course, multi-site is an option. So is church planting. And there's hybrids in between those two. But I think what we've seen play out is that multi-site has been a more successful way to plant a healthy, thriving church. And so I think the model is just getting more adopted, and it's helping healthy churches kind of repot. I'm a gardener, right? So kind of divide and reroot and help reach more people.
I believe Tony used to say, and I think the Unstuck group would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that multi-site is not a growth strategy.
That's right.
It's like, we want to reach more people, so therefore we'll launch another location. That it is something that churches that are already growing do.
Yep.
Can you, first of all, is that accurate? Secondly, can you explain that distinction?
Yeah, while it produces growth in many cases, it is not a growth strategy. It's an evangelism strategy. So there's very specific things, that we coach churches on when they want to go multi-site. Churches that do really well with multi-site, they have health and momentum before they launch a new location, right? They launch out of this place of health and momentum, and they're replicating something that's already healthy. They're also larger. I don't know how this overlays in Canada, because I know churches are, there's larger churches in America than there are in Canada. But you need to have, they launch well because they launch with a healthy core. In the States, we say you need to be at least 1,000 before launch, preferably 2,000, because it's this critical mass in not only launching a new location well, but maintaining the health of the original location. So those numbers, those percentages would probably change. I'm working with Canadian churches that are maybe 600 and they're going multi-site. So they don't need 1,000, but they probably need a good 60 to 100 to seed and to be in that new church, because they need to. And by the way, we say send people who live in that area. That's a mistake we often make. We recruit people and say, will you go there for a year? And it's like, well, no, we want you to live there. We want you to invite your friends there. We want you to be a part of it. But you're sending out a healthy core that's going to serve, give, invite.
So your recommendation is in the US, you got to be 1,000, ideally 2,000? Wow.
Yeah. We have bigger buildings. I don't know.
Okay. What other surprising findings do you have that church leaders should be paying attention to?
Couple of trends from my seat. First off, there is a growing challenge for finding and hiring leaders on church staff teams.
I'm so glad you raised that.
Yeah. It's everywhere I go. And, unfortunately, when they're in a place of growth, it's even more of a place of panic because they don't have the people on the bench to raise up. And so I just think churches, you need to have a plan. You need to play the movie forward and go, if we're going to just like double your church size, if we're 500 people today and we're growing, at some point we're going to be 1,000. What does our structure look like? And who do we need to be looking for? Because we need to get systems in place to raise up the future leaders. These outside hires can be good, but if we're always banking on just posting a job and hoping the ideal candidate comes to us, it's not a good strategy. I look at our transition at Unstuck. Part of the reason we've made it through our transition is because we've had an intentional development plan for our leaders, for us. So we all need to be thinking about our bench and figure out, how are we going to get volunteers engaged? How are we going to create volunteer leader positions so that when we have an opening, we have a bench within our own church to look at, to hire people in? I don't think seminaries are growing. So for churches who have been relying on seminaries to produce their next pastor, we just have to raise these people up. Do you agree with that?
I totally agree with it. And, this will be maybe my last question for you, Amy. Most people out there are like, agreed? How? Like what are the best ways to do it? And, I think about that. I was at Connexus, the church I helped found yesterday, working with a couple of next-gen communicators in their early 30s. And I mean, these are leaders we prayed for, leaders we've, raised up to some extent. And I know when you find that really great communicator or two, it is really difficult. Like that's not just, oh yeah, we had 20 to choose from. No. Usually you don't. And even for me to find a successor, that was like a 5-year project. And it was someone we hired almost a decade before he became lead pastor, but it was in-house, like just raising him up in-house rather than me, I'm tapping out, we're going to bring someone else in from the outside.
Right.
But that is really hard work. What advice do you have for leaders who are like, yeah, I don't even know?
Well, there are some roles on your team that they don't need to be specialists in it, if that makes sense. When I talked about hire a discipleship leader who oversees all the next steps you want people to take after they attend your weekend service, you just need a builder. You need someone who's relational. Well, obviously, they need to love Jesus. They need to have a strong faith. They need to have that type of background, or you need to provide some for them. But they just need to know how to build teams and how to cast vision and how to focus on developing people versus developing products, right? Now, if you need a youth pastor who needs to teach, well, that's a little bit more of a specialty. You're going to be looking a little bit harder for that one over time, but you need environments where you can try out people's giftings. And by the way, I don't recommend on the weekend trying out those gifts. I feel like the weekend is a place to use developed gifts, not try out new ones. But these people are in your church. They're often in your church. I look at me. I got called out of ministry back in 2002. Called out of corporate. Will you leave your corporate job and come oversee this? And I wasn't an expert in any of the areas I was leading, but I knew how to lead the people who were. So those are the type of leaders that are huge load lifters, because some of the specialty positions, they take a little bit more time. when I hire a worship leader, I'm not looking per se for a leader within my church. I'm saying submit a video so I can see that you have the competence first. But
right.
Yeah. So a little bit depends on who you're hiring.
What you said is very true. When I always look for leaders, I'm like, how do you tell a leader? Well, they're already leading something.
They're already
In
doing
other
it.
words, they're out there in the community. They're in their company. They're organizing the parents. They're active in the community. They're doing something and other people are following. And then you tap them on the shoulder and go, hey, would you want to give your life to a bigger mission? And that's the thing you're looking for. And that was true when our church was 20 people.
Yep.
And it's true when it's thousands.
And let me add to that. Here's what I see a lot when I'm sitting around the table with the senior leadership team and they have a big gap on their team and leadership. I always challenge them, who's in your church? And it's funny, they say no for people. Well, he's the VP of fill in the blank. He's probably making—
He would never.
8 times. He would never. And I'm like, try. I have the conversation. God could already be at work. And, I just got an email this week, an update from a church. This guy left the company, took it. Let me see. He makes 1/10 less than what he made in his corporate job. I know, isn't that crazy? But he's moving into that significance phase. And he's excited about what God's doing in the church. And God's always at work before we make the ask. So don't say no for people, make the ask.
Yeah.
All they can say is no.
One of my favorite hires was someone who was working for Pepsi. She was young, in her 30s. And I'm like, well, you want to addict people to sugar water or change people's lives? And she was great. She was fantastic. Took a big pay cut. Amy, this is great. So thank you so much. And thank you that by God's grace, you were able to continue the ministry of the Unstuck group. If people want to connect with the Unstuck group online, follow your podcast, what's an easy place for them to do that?
Yeah, a couple things really quick. I said earlier, Carrie, like as a church leader, if you don't know your data, you need to. And so for your listeners, Carrie, we wanted to offer a free month of access to our Unstuck Learning Hub so they can go in and take the vital signs assessment that we were talking about. It shows churches, we talked about a couple metrics, but it shows how churches are doing in 15 areas and how they compare to the benchmarks of healthy churches. So I said it, your dad is telling you a story, so your listeners can get a free month of access. So if you go to our website, which is just theunstuckgroup.com, you'll find our learning hub there and just use the coupon code Carey, Carey, and you'll get in there for a month. And by the way, not just the vital signs assessment, but there's Unstuck Teams, the Unstuck Church assessment, lots of resources in there for you. So 30 days where you can just go around in there. And then, yes, the podcast, we drop a new episode every Wednesday of the Unstuck Church podcast. And it is the #1 resource pastors quote back to us all the time and telling us they find it valuable. So sorry you had to listen to my gravelly voice this whole time.
Yeah. Well, we've had some internet issues here with a big storm that went through, and you're not feeling 100%, but this was a great conversation. And I want to thank you so much for it, Amy.
Thanks for having me, Carrie. It's an honor.
And thanks for doing the good work that you do.